Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we are going to cover something very interesting, and that is JSON schema validation. Now, first and foremost, let's think about why do we need to assert JSON schema validation. So let's take an example of what we have here in Explore Booking API. If I open this, we have this post request, and if I run this post request, in this particular case, what we are doing is we are passing some fields in the input, and those are exactly the fields that we're getting in the output with an addition of just an extra booking ID. But in real life projects, what will happen is there would be some APIs which will be minimalistic like this, and then there would be some APIs which will consolidate data from multiple APIs, and then you will see more information than what you're passing in your test input, right? And so take an example. For example, in this particular case, let's say if you call in booking API, and if we provide all these booking details, and if it also fetch some information about the customer details, and if it fetches the information about address details here. So let's say if there were more entities present here about customer details and customer's address details, you would not be able to assert those details because you're not controlling the input data to assert those fields. So what do we do then? Should we just leave them as is? Well, that could be one option, but a better option would be if you could at least assert that, when I'm making a call to this particular API, these are the fields that I can test, and these are the fields that I expect to be, let's say, present either mandatorily or optionally. And a JSON schema is something that gives you that kind of power. Also, for example, in this particular case, if you look into this particular test, we are only asserting the things that we know. But what if there was a new field that was present here, which maybe was not expected? And then you got multiple options. Either you are okay with that extra field being present in the response, or you're not okay with presence of that particular field in the response. Now, the place where you can decide if you're okay with that extra field or not is something that you can again define in your JSON schema. So because of all these useful features, it also makes sense that not only we assert for status code, not only we assert for the input that we are passing in our request, we also assert for the overall response schema. So with that said, now let's look into how we can add capabilities for asserting JSON schema validation. So let's say if we do Windows 1, let's go and search for RestAssured IO. Over here, we have documentation for getting started. So let's click on this. And if we scroll down, JSON path, XML path, we have this dependency for doing JSON schema validation. And it says if you want to validate that a JSON response conforms to a schema, you can use a JSON schema validator. So we will go ahead and copy this and do Windows 2. Then let's go to our POM file and let's open the POM file. And below RestAssured dependency, I'm going to copy paste this. In terms of version, the RestAssured version is 5.3.0. The same is the version for schema validator. So let's just use the same version here and we'll say RestAssured version. And the place where I'm going to write the logic for JSON schema validation is going to be in the verify response class, and this under asserts package, which again is inside the test package. And that is the reason I'm not going to remove the scope of test here. We'll keep the scope of test here. So let's download Maven dependencies. So I click on this, and with this we have got the dependency downloaded. So now let's go back. And now let's see how to make use of it. So if you click on the refer to the documentation for more info part, it specifies that from version 2.1.0, RestAssured now has support for JSON schema validation. For example, given the following schema located in the class path as this file name, you can do a couple of things, something like, so you make a call to your API endpoint, and then you have to put in this keyword called then, which will give you a validatable response. And then you can specify the body, and then you can pass on this method as a static import where you specify the path of the file. So if it is in the class path, it should be able to pick this file, and it should be able to validate the response. Now, which files are in the class path? Any file which is present in the resource repository would be in the class path. So what we can do is let's first create a schema file, and then we will try to make use of this command to be able to assert our JSON response. So now, how do we create a JSON schema file? What you can do is, if you go to Aqua, let's open the Explore Booking API again, and let's say if I make a call on the post API, this is the response that we have got. And imagine this is like your full and final response, which contains all the optional mandatory fields. What you can do is you can copy this response, and you can actually say convert JSON to schema. And then you have got a bunch of free online converters available. You can pick any of them. So let's say if we pick the first one, what we can do is we can come here, we can copy paste this response, say I'm not a robot, and generate schema. Let's look at what is being generated. So it says a JSON schema is being generated. It has got schema org draft version 4. The type is an object type, JSON object type. And these are all the properties that are inside this particular schema. You have a booking ID, which is of type integer. You have a booking JSON object, which contains, so it's a JSON object, and it contains multiple properties like first name, which is a string, last name is string, total price an integer, deposit paid is a boolean, booking dates is an object, which contains two fields, check-in and check-out, which again are string fields. Now, by default, it is assuming that, for example, this booking dates are mandatory, which in our case is also the case, and it is assuming that it is specifying additional needs as string, and then it is specifying all the fields that it thinks are mandatory. Now, by default, it is assuming that all the fields are mandatory. We know that additional needs is not mandatory, so we can trim that later. And it also expects a booking ID to be present, and it expects a booking JSON object to be present. So let's copy the whole thing. And if we copy the whole thing, what we can do is we can open Aqua again. And as I said, we want to put our file in the class path. So any file which is directly present in the resource repository is in the class path. So let's say we create a new file, and I will call it as booking schema.json. And the style that I'm using is kebab case. So normally for creating any normal text files, we use kebab case. As you can see, also here is the case with JSON platform properties. And let's add our schema here. So with this, we have the schema available. I mentioned that, for example, additional needs is not mandatory. So we can remove this, and everything else is mandatory at this particular moment, right? So now let's just go ahead and try to run a test, a very simple test. Even before we start adding anything in the verify response class, let's go to our do not use RestAssured only test, and let's see if we could make use of the method which was specified here. So it says for you to be able to make this assertion, you need to be able to call this then method, and then inside the body you should be able to call this assertion. So at this moment I'm only copying this part, and let's say if I go to Aqua, after then, so this is validatable response. If I give body, so if I give body and matches JSON schema in class path, so I'll do an alt enter. With this we get the dependency downloaded, which is JSON schema validator, and instead of calling it as product schema.json, I will call it as booking schema.json, right? And then let's run this test and see if this test is working fine or not. Okay, everything looks good. It seems to be matching the need of whatever is specified in the schema, right? And let's say in the test, if we go back to the test, let's say if I don't provide additional needs breakfast field, let's see if it is still able to work with it. So let's say if I comment these two lines, and yeah, so you don't need any, do we need any comma here? I don't think so. This is the last field, right? So let's run it again. And see if it works fine or not. right? So in this case, what we've done is we have made additional needs as optional, so we did not provide it inside, and everything worked as expected, right? So we got a valid response. But what if additional response, additional needs was a mandatory field? So if we would have defined this field as mandatory, then if this field was missing, actually it will complain that, hey, this field was mandatory, but now it is missing from the response. So if you run the test again, you see, now we have got an error which says object has a missing required property called additional needs, and it says these are all the required fields and one of the fields is missing, which is additional needs from this actual response. And that brings me back to like thinking about multiple possibilities that can happen, while trying to do a JSON schema validation. So let's say if I do Windows 1, and if you go back to our project, if I open this, we can actually have multiple scenarios that can happen. So imagine if you define a field in schema, like in this case it was additional needs, and if you make it mandatory. So if you define a field as mandatory, and if you get that field in the response, you don't have a problem, right? This is exactly what we expect. But if you define a field as mandatory, and then if it is missing in the response, then the test would fail, which is exactly what happened here. Let's go back. If you define a field as optional, and then if it is present, it is completely fine. But if you define a field as optional, like we did with additional needs before, by skipping this, Windows 2, if you define a field as optional, and then if it is not present, it is completely okay. So that's acceptable, right? So we already covered these scenarios in the previous test. And if something is not defined in the schema, and then if something is not present in the response, that is completely expected. But there's one more situation that can happen, and that is you do not define something in the schema, but something is present in the response. Then you have to decide if it is okay or not, if that response is acceptable or not. To give an example, we already saw all these scenarios. This scenario we know that would be completely fine. So now we are testing for this last scenario. So let's say if I go back, so the last scenario is we don't specify a field in the schema, but somehow a field exists, right? So we will see both cases in which we will say it is okay if the field is present because we expect our response to grow, or we say no, this is exactly the response we want, and please don't add any other fields. So to take this example, what we can do is, let's run this test again. I have removed the additional field need to be non-mandatory again. So this test should now pass. And for example, what we see is that the booking ID is something that we always get, right? And let's say for some reason, if I remove the field booking ID from properties, so if I I think I have to just cut it because you cannot comment fields in JSON schema. So I'll copy this, and now we have not specified booking ID, and so booking ID should not be here in the required field. We only have booking. And now I want to specify, like at this moment, if I don't specify any other rules, this will pass. So if I run this, because we not specified booking ID and booking ID exists in the response, there would not be any problem. The response passes. But now what I want to do is I want to say, hey, if there are any other additional fields, make this schema validation as failed. And the way you can do it is you have to copy paste this particular property which says additional properties are false. So what you're saying is we don't expect any other additional properties, and if there are any properties available, please fail the schema validation. So in our case, we know that booking ID will always be generated, and in this case, because we don't define it in the schema, it should fail. So let's run it again. And it fails. It says object instances properties which are not allowed by the schema booking ID. And additional properties, it says this was the property, it was false. it is unwanted, we didn't want it, and in any case it is present. If you want to like make it explicit, you can say additional property is true. Then if you make it true, then actually it will be able to accept this particular response. Right? So for now, what I will do is I'll keep it as false until we have a use case where we say we want it to be true. I want it to be a little bit strict. And with this, if you look at all the scenarios that are specified over here, all of them are covered in the schema, right? Now, before I go further and refactor this code into, let's say, a fluent method inside the verify response class, there's one more thing that I want to talk about. So for example, if we go back to browser, you can search for, let's say, JSON schema. You have this official documentation available from JSON schema, and if you click on this, I'm not going to go into more details, but let's say if you click on learn and if you click on getting started step by step, you can just go through some basic introduction here, which says introduction, starting schema, defining the properties, going deeper with properties, nesting data structures, reference outside schema, taking a look at the data for our defined schema. So this is a very good website to understand, what JSON schema is, why do we need it. For example, you can specify, what kind of schema it is, the description for it. You can, for each property, you can define if it is integer, if it is string, you can give a description to it. You can specify if the property is required or not required. We already have seen the case for this. And for example, for things like integers, you can specify, for example, the price of the product, exclusive, minimum. So, the minimum number should be more than 0. So there are a lot of things that you can do once you understand how JSON schema works properly, right? So I'm not going to go into details, but I just want to mention this so that you can go into your own free time and understand what JSON schema is. Now, if I go back, we have seen how to add JSON schema. We have seen how to create a JSON schema from the response that we get from our test. We've also done a test to see if we're able to do JSON schema assertion or not. And now what we can do is we can try to move this logic, instead of trying to do this, in each particular test one by one, I would like to now move this logic inside a fluent method in our verify response class. So what I will do is I'll just make a copy of this method and I will call it as, let's say, matches schema in matches schema from a file, or I don't know, in a file, matches schema in a file. And then in here we could actually give a file path, in fact file class path, just to make it more clearer. And what we're going to do is, instead of saying response.getBody, we note that if we give response then we get a validatable response, and then we should be able to click on body, and then actually if I go back, we should be able to copy this particular thing. And then if I copy this will be able to assert the response with the JSON schema. And instead of giving this file name as hard-coded, now we should be able to give this as a file class path, right? So I'm going to give us file class path. By the way, if I remove this, just to show you how many options are available, in JSON schema validation, you have an option to do matches JSON schema either via a URI or a URL. So you don't always have to give a file path. And if, let's say, your schema is available somewhere online, you can give the URL. You can also specify a file type, so you can give file type, or you can give it as a reader, or you can define the whole schema as a string, or you can give it as input stream. But since we are defining our JSON schema in a file, I think the easiest way is to define it as matches JSON schema in class path and to define the path of the file, right? So this is the one that we are using. Now once you use this, you cannot use, for example, so let me say described as schema validation, and you cannot give now as uh, you know, things like is true or whatever. You just have to say get writable assertion info. That is all that we need now. And it returns a self type, so we should be able to do fluent method chaining now, right? So let's just try to go ahead and see if we could make use of this method in one of our existing tests. So in our before each method, after we assert our response, I was asserting for status code and for booking, but I was not able to assert for example, for booking ID. Let's go ahead and change that, right? So I'll say matches schema in a file, and I'll give the name of the file, which was specified here. And I don't have to give any path because it's in the class path, right? It's already defined in the resource repository, in the root of the resource repository, so I don't have to change anything here. And this should work. Now I think I also made one change in the schema where I removed the booking ID. So let me go back to free online JSON, and I'll click on this button here which is copy to clipboard and Windows 2, and I'll add the additional properties false later, so I'll just replace the whole thing, Control V. So now we have the booking ID, booking everything available, additional needs is not mandatory. I will remove this, and I'm going to add additional properties as false, right? So I'm saying we want it to be strict validation. And let's see, there's one more, I think, additional items. Okay, all of default, depreciation message, max items, max length. So we also get some sort of IntelliSense here, in terms of what all options are available to us. For now, this is good enough. So if I go back to the test, I'm not asserting the booking ID here, but with this, we should at least be able to assert that there should be something called booking ID, which is a mandatory field which should be present, right? So if I run the test again, let's see how this goes. Cool. So everything seems to be fine. We have got our response and everything seems to be fine. Let's see. Let me go back. Whether something is defined as mandatory, and if it was not present, we saw it as failing. If something is optional, then it could be present, it could not be present. In both the cases, it will be okay. If something is not defined and if it is not present, it's no problem. And so if something is not defined, but if it is present, then we also saw that with the help of additional properties, we will be able to decide if the test should pass or if the test should fail, right? So with this, I think we have covered all the aspects of JSON schema validation, and we have seen how we can write fluent assertions using this matches schema in a file to assert also the fields that we are not controlling in our own input, and that could be coming from, let's say, from other APIs as in consolidated output, in the API that you are calling. So we have another powerful tool in our basket, and yeah, with this I think we can wrap up this video. See you guys in another video. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.